Exactly 29 years ago this week, a bomb ripped through a Berlin discotheque, killing 4 and injuring 230. A message intercepted from Tripoli to the Libyan embassy in Berlin put the blame squarely on Gaddafi. 10 days later, 18 American fighter jets were en route to Libya to exact their revenge. But on their way, they saw something. Smoke rising from a dark shadow just below the surface of the Mediterranean between Tunisia and Sicily. What these pilots had rediscovered was an ancient underwater volcano named Empedocles, which has had a strangely notable history. Its peak has occasionally sat above the surface of the water, forming a temporary island. This was first noted in 300 BC, again in 10 BC, but its appearance in 1831 was perhaps the most memorable. Black rock pierced the surface of the water and remained. Countries rushed to claim ownership of the world's newest land. The British Royal Navy landed first, planted a British flag, and dubbed their new territory Graham Island. But before long, the King of Two Sicilies sent a ship to tear down the British flag, and they renamed the island Ferdinandia. Of course, Spain claimed ownership, and even France sent a scientific mission to plant a French flag and name the island Julia. For the next 5 months, Empedocles, this volcano, became a global hotspot. Tourists flocked to see the world's newest island, and there was even talk of setting up a holiday resort on its black sand beaches. But just as quickly as it rose from the water, the volcano receded back under the Mediterranean, taking with it the diplomatic conflict. Now, there was an eruption in the 1960s, and recent seismic activity suggests the island could once again rise. And yet, the issue of ownership is not yet solved. And if it were to return, surely the new nations of Malta, Libya, and Tunisia would claim it lay within their borders. I find this story fascinating because it emphasizes the truly arbitrary nature of our borders. No matter how many flags we plant in the ground or lines we draw on a map, the Earth cares not. Borders are man-made creations, and even in our brief history on this planet, are actually relatively new. Human history is one of vast migration. The Delphic priests of ancient Greece considered unfettered movement one of the 4 principles distinguishing liberty and slavery. Newcomers brought with them wealth, experience, served in local armies. There was really no reason to turn anyone away. It wasn't until the rise of serfdom in around 300 AD under the Roman Empire that restrictions on movement became commonplace. And when the Renaissance came and serfdom began to disappear, we didn't see free movement. Instead, nationalistic ideologies unified people under the idea of a single state. And with the fall of the major European empires and the post-World War I political realignment, borders were closed. And over the past century, amidst further conflict and tightened immigration controls, this trend has continued. Even going on holiday can be a frustrating and humiliating experience for many people. Imagine waiting in a visa line like this. And, you know, as great as Game of Thrones is as a TV show, the winter is not coming, and we don't live in a barbaric era anymore. So are strict controls over movement and closed borders really necessary in a global society? My friend Steve and I decided the best way to try to answer this question and to learn more about borders was to try to cross them.
In fact, last summer, Nate and I decided to embark on something called the Mongol Rally, a 20,000-kilometer journey starting in London, England, taking us through 23 countries and 3 breakaway states, all the way to Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. And if that wasn't adventurous enough, we decided to do it all in this old Fiat Panda, and to do it in just 5 weeks' time. We also brought this cool X with us to have people sign who we met along the way. One of the things about the rally, as you can imagine, going 20,000 kilometers took a lot of time. We spent about 300 hours total driving. But in addition to those 300 hours driving, we spent about 150 hours just waiting at borders. Now, in the EU era, going through the borders in Europe is quite easy. You're driving and all of a sudden you're just in another country. Of course, no one knows that better than Lithuanians, where right here in Vilnius you can just walk and be in another country with Užupis. But it's once you leave Lithuania that it starts to get more challenging and time-consuming. For example, it took us 8 hours to get into Belarus, 12 hours to get into Ukraine, a 2-day adventure to be able to get into Moldova because we got to a border, it's closed, there's conflict, go halfway around the country to get into another border. Only an hour to get into Transnistria, which sounds great. Then you realize this isn't even a real country. They're just a self-declared nation state that still demands that you show your passport and get admitted into their entrance. 6 hours into Georgia, 10 hours into Azerbaijan, where we then got stuck for 3 days because turns out as Americans, it's kind of hard to get into Iran, even if you think you have your visa situation sorted. Visa situation didn't work to get into Turkmenistan, and then we ended up driving north into Dagestan and into Russia. It took us 11 hours to get into Uzbekistan. By the time we finally got to the front of that queue, one of the border guards decided to take a small football out of our car and then play with it with his dog for an hour while completely ignoring everyone else behind us. We learned once we got to Kyrgyzstan, if we just lied and said that we were diplomats, we could get to the front of the line, where we were greeted with big smiles and, yes, fried chicken. Unfortunately, that didn't work to get into Mongolia, where it took us an additional 15 hours. And that's not the entirety of all of the borders. Those are really just the highlights. All told, like I said, 150 hours just waiting at borders. That equates to about 4 hours a day. And that's not 4 hours per border. That's just 4 hours each day over the course of the 5 weeks, which is roughly the amount of time that we slept, you can imagine, during the course of the journey. And that time wasn't really productive or useful, had no real utility. Basically, most of it was spent waiting. Eventually, someone asks you to take everything out of your car, put it aside, fill out some papers, pay some fees. Then you get to the other side of the border where you once again wait, take everything out of the car, et cetera, et cetera. And even the border guards knew that this was really useless. They were making fun of it, but they still had to do it anyway because that's just what we do. Fortunately, we did get to spend some time not just driving and not just waiting at borders, where we got to do some cool stuff. We actually broke into this old communist monument in Bulgaria called Buzludza. We got to take this beautiful hot air balloon ride in Cappadocia in Turkey. We got to see the remnants of the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan, the Lenin Square in Minsk, the Lenin Square in Gomel, the Lenin Square in Tiraspol, the Lenin Square in Novosibirsk, the Lenin Square in Ulan-Ude. You get the point. Certainly a lot of Lenin Squares along the way. But for us, really the most memorable part, the most impactful part of the journey was certainly the friends and the conversation and the meals that we had along the way with people old and new, and the kinds of stories and memories we created with them. For example, when we got into Siberia, at one point our exhausts basically just fell off the car, which it turns out you need. And so we were able to find this great guy who actually welded it back onto the bottom of the car for us. And he was so excited that we could pay him in these coins for his coin collection. And we gave him all the exotic currency that we had collected along the way. But as I reflect on those kinds of stories and those kinds of experiences, it begs the question, what kinds of experiences did we miss out on because of all that time that we spent at borders? And more broadly, what is humanity missing out on because of all of the time and effort that we spend constructing these lines between you and me, and then turning guns onto the other side of those lines? Think of all the conflict that has been started because of these arbitrary lines that we draw on maps.
And it's not just in places like Eastern Europe and Palestine. Even Quebec refuses to acknowledge its border with Newfoundland, claiming ownership over part of the province to this very day. Now, I don't think there's going to be a French-Canadian invasion anytime soon, but the problem is not just with border disputes. It's estimated that by allowing free movement of people, we can increase the global economic impact by 50%. It's been shown that allowing people to move across their borders for work is the single most effective way to reduce poverty, more than any other development initiative. Now, you might be thinking, if we allow all these people to move for work, we'll wreak havoc on countries' economies. Well, these fears headline newspapers in the United States a century ago, before its population quadrupled. And I think things have gone pretty well since. Besides, the world is already opening up. Just 30 years ago, it would have been unthinkable to drive from London to even Vilnius. And people risked their lives to get from one side of Berlin to the other. Myanmar recently opened its borders, and for the first time in decades, Americans can visit Cuba. Just look at how much Europe's borders have transformed over the past 100 years. It's time to think big and plan for the next 100 years. The 20th century was one of nation states. What will the 21st century look like? Can we envision a world where borders perhaps define our World Cup teams but not shackle us to our geographies? Where the term global citizen is not science fiction but lies at the very core of our societies? It starts by realizing that borders exist solely in the minds of men. Citizenship is a thing of chance, a combination of time and space and history. And by acknowledging that the emotional fervor around the sanctity and the impenetrability of our borders is excessive. We're facing unprecedented challenges. Climate change, the next Ebola-like epidemic. Solving these problems is going to require global collaboration and coordination. And that can't happen if we're preoccupied worrying about rival nations bombing our discotheques. But I'm hopeful. Because the thing that we truly learned on this journey to Mongolia is not that borders are silly and a waste of time, but rather that whether we're in a bar in Belarus or a mountain yurt in Kyrgyzstan, we can be welcomed not as outsiders, but as family. This image was taken in 1990 by the Voyager space probe, 5 billion kilometers from our planet. And as I look at it, I don't see you and me and a line separating us. I just see that we're all unified together on this pale blue dot. Thank you very much.